Hi, my name is Phil. I like talking about politics, and this is the political post box where we run through some of the more engaged with comments on the videos from this channel from the past week. Obviously, there are a couple of topics that are likely to be prominent, so let's just get straight into it. But first, if you'd like to be notified of daily news and politics, then please subscribe to the channel and click the bell notification icon. So, first of all, forget that out of the way. The comment here, it's the best time for Brexit. It's much easier now to isolate in the herd immunity country from the lockdown EU. Much less political backlash. I'm not quite sure if this person's entirely serious, but there are a number of people that have been expressing the serious intention that Brexit, particularly a hard Brexit, would be more ideal now. This is based on the video I did when David Davis, who was the first Brexit secretary, said pretty much this. That it'll actually be better to do now. It is much, much worse to do it now. And the reason is, first of all, actually, the political backlash will be much greater. In fact, I shall be doing a video on this later this week anyway. We've got a little bit of a taste in some ways of some of the effects of a very hard Brexit. We have a scenario where we have empty shelves. We have a scenario where people are panicking. We also have a scenario whereby in an emergency, the government are setting out a changing pattern of life for citizens, and the citizens are not engaging with that. So at some point, we're going to have to see a bit of a crackdown. This could spiral out of control from a social point of view. Obviously, in the case of a no-deal Brexit, we wouldn't be talking about a virus that won't be any respecter of laws or borders. But, you know, the level of civil disobedience that we're already seeing on a low level, albeit a very serious level at the moment, just gives you a taste of things to come. And the idea that, you know, when the economic impact of the current crisis is, of course, going to be severe. It is already noticeable. It's already noticeable to many. And it is, of course, going to be much more severe. And, you know, politically speaking, Boris Johnson may get away with the worst of that. His government may get away with the worst of that. Because at the end of the day, the economic impact is going to be severe for everyone, even for countries whose governments have actually played it correctly. And even if you can say at the end of this that our government, because they were slow to react, the consequences were much more serious. When you're talking about the economic impact, it's going to be difficult to really say how much worse it was for us than for other countries. I'm sure that those experts will be able to come up with a figure after some time, but it won't be immediate. And of course, we know a lot of people aren't really keen on listening to experts. Oh, except when their lives are at stake. At that point, some people are. Although it still has to be said, many people are ignoring that advice. But if you're going to have a situation where you have this economic impact from the corona crisis, and then you add onto it Brexit, you won't be able to hide it as some people think. You may be able to hide the extent because it's sort of all blurred, but you won't be able to hide it full stop, because take now, people are panic buying. That is why certain shelves are empty in the supermarkets in Britain, because people are panic buying. It's entirely because the demand has spiked unreasonably, not the supply. There's no issue with the supply at all, no serious issue anyway. In the event of a no-deal Brexit, that panic buying will be there again. Only this time there will be an issue with supply, because we won't be able to get certain things, and the things we can get are going to take longer. So, you know, sudden spikes in demand. And although the shops will be able to predict this further in advance, they won't necessarily know which commodities are going to come under the heaviest demand, really, from consumers. Some of them are predictable, some not so much. So there will be that panic will feed more panic, because although I would absolutely echo the government's urging not to panic buy at the moment, because there is no need. There is genuinely no need to stockpile food at the moment. Really isn't. You know, even when you're talking about people who have to self-isolate, well, you have to self-isolate for more than a week. In fact, really, what we should be doing as far as possible is isolating for many months. we can still get the food to us and we can still go out shopping. And of course, the elderly people shouldn't, or people in vulnerable groups shouldn't go out shopping. But if the rest of us who can just went out and observed sensible measures, and those who are most at risk had the shopping brought to them, deliveries, click and collect, that sort of thing, then the capacity is there for that. And where there isn't quite enough capacity, then the industry will manage it. It is already adapting quite well. But in the event of a no-deal Brexit, it becomes much more difficult. And although I still wouldn't advocate panic buying as such, I wouldn't criticise people for doing some stockpiling of food or medicines ahead of it, because we are going to have a shortage in supply as well as an excessive amount of demand. So yes, although this will be bad and it will blur at the extent, the effects of a no-deal Brexit, it will get. Let's say we went ahead with the no-deal Brexit on the 1st of January 2021, which is the current plan. Officially, I don't believe it actually really is behind closed doors, but it may be. And again, I'm going to have to talk about that later this week as well. If we did that, it would get noticeably worse after that point, to the point where you can't hide it. You can hide the extent, but you cannot hide the fact that things have got much, much worse. So on top of a catastrophe, we had a calamity, basically. So no, it is absolute. If there is a good time to go for a no-deal Brexit, and of course there is not, but if we say if there's at least a best time to go for it, right now is the worst time to go for it. When I say right now, I mean even strategically, doing it at the end of the year is absolutely the worst time to go for it. The no-deal Brexit, if you're going to go through it at all, in anything like a way where we could emerge at the other end, even in 40 years' time, it cannot be in the next few years, quite frankly. But we will see where we end up with that. On to the next comment. So again, related to the no-deal Brexit, this time it's related to the story that was in a Tory-supported newspaper last week about talks about extending the transition period, but not just yet, waiting for the politically opportune moment. And because it's a Tory-backing newspaper, the reports are likely to be accurate. That doesn't mean to say that absolutely, definitely the government are going to extend. I think they will. I think it makes sense. But, you know, it will. The intention will be reliable. So someone's saying here, what happened to I'd rather die in a ditch? No ifs, no buts. Johnson's rhetoric there. Brexiters don't mind being shafted by their fierce leader. It's not the first time, blah, blah, blah. Expletive deleted. But anyway, on to the main point. It says, of course, this is a good idea and inevitable. The extension, that is. Next, could we rejoin the EU because the UK can't absorb a double whammy to the economy, as I've just been talking about? Watch Brexiteers quietly accept the decision, a few whimpers over a warm half pint at the pub. I'm afraid it won't be as simple as that. You can already see in the comments, any video where I talk about extending. If I talked about extending the transition period, which I did back in January, you get the usual opposition. And those comments are still there, but you notice a real intensity of different types of comments, a real like desperation, fury. And that is because I think the Brexit supporters recognise that we are very, very likely to extend the transition period. And they really genuinely believe, or some of them seem to, I don't know how many trolls and how many bots, but some of them are people, some of them are real people. And they very genuinely believe that we need to leave the EU. They believe all these, I mean, they tell me about the things they believe. It's absolute nonsense. And you try and challenge them, show me this thing, then they can't show you. It's the usual story. But they absolutely still believe we need to go. And I think it's a little bit like last year when there was a realistic prospect of putting this to another referendum. And you saw that same desperation before the opposition handed Boris Johnson the keys to the no-deal Brexit for reasons. But I think they believe that we are going to extend as well. I think there is but it's not a quiet acceptance. It's a furious acceptance. It's the usual thing. Brexit's been stolen from them. Treachery, treason. And so they will be. But what I would like to think, and again I want to tap on this in a bit more detail elsewhere, what I would like to think is we already had over the past few years more people realising that actually leaving the EU is not a good decision. And I think we're increasingly going to get to the point where We will have to extend. Let's say we extend for a year. I mean, initially it might be a 6-month extension and then they extend for another 6 months. So let's say in the end it's at least a year. By the time we get another year in, there could be a real groundswell of opinion in the country that we really shouldn't be at least leaving the single market. Obviously, we will no longer be members of the EU. That will be, but to actually leave the EU itself, we've left the membership, but to leave the EU itself, we should be paying as associate members at least, as in, like Norway, they're not really associate members in the real sense, but they have access to the single market, that we're going to need to retain that. And again, it comes down to this, and I'm not trying to draw any link with how this will affect it, because that's quite sad to think about. But as we've always said, 70% of elderly people voted for Brexit. And yes, I know for those who are elderly and voted against it, yes, that still means 30% voted against it. I get that. But 70% voted for it. Large majority voted for it. Of young people, it's reversed. 70% of young people voted against it. They voted to remain. Just 30% for it. Now, that meant there was a significant minority in each camp going the other way. And of course, as time has gone on, the elderly have passed on and more young people have emerged to be of voting age. And I'm not talking about this crisis, affecting elderly people more either. It's got nothing to do with that, although it does. I don't wish to talk about that. But just again, another couple of years down the line, another year and a half down the line, again, you've got a smaller proportion of the voting public being those people with their rose-tinted glasses that, don't want to be in the EU, and the younger people who have no fear of it, they actually think it's marvellous, becoming a voting age. And you're really going to get a tipping point fairly soon, because what this crisis is demonstrating is we cannot manage without access to the single market. We've already got empty shelves right now. I'm just doing normal shopping because I know that the supply chain has not been affected. What happens when it is affected? And it still comes back to that, just like I said in the previous comment, what happens when that supply chain is affected? So yeah, I don't see how the government can be insane enough to go through this no deal Brexit scenario now. And I actually don't think they'll ever be able to do it, because I think we've had a taste of it now. And let's say they did go through it, because the impact would be so severe. The backlash would be immediate. People wouldn't wait to see how it panned out, because they'll have seen how it pans out with the corona crisis. They will not want another dose, an even worse dose of it as well. But those are my thoughts on that. Next one. Oh no, I was just a little. That was actually. I'll come to this anyway. So this was actually just a little reminder. I think it was the last one. About putting Brexit above the virus or on an equal footing in terms of importance would be lunacy. It would be, because again, I've showed this graph actually in a previous video, but just to do it again, just to quickly emphasise, and this is a few days out of date now, the situation is worse. Because I keep seeing in the comments people going, oh, right, it's worse in like Italy, France and Germany. No, it's not. It's worse in the UK than all those countries. You can see on this graph, the only country in Europe that has a worse rate and this is death rate, it's Spain. And Spain has now adopted more severe measures than we have in the UK. And yet people will still think that, and because they can't understand, because we're behind the curve, we've got fewer numbers. But remember, we've got fewer numbers of deaths because we're behind everywhere else. In a couple of weeks' time, see where we are. And also, few cases, because they're going, oh, we haven't got as many cases. Because we're not testing. We don't know how many cases we've got. I mean, no country will really know accurately enough how many cases we've got. Maybe South Korea, because they're really good at the testing. But we have one of the worst ideas about how many people are infected, because we are not routinely testing people who develop symptoms. Even when some people are hospitalised with symptoms, they're not always being tested. It's only for the very severely ill or vulnerable when they're developing these symptoms and put into hospital that are being tested. Now, that is supposed to be increasing, but it's not increasing enough. I think there was some talk at the end of last week of doubling the rate of testing. Well, double nothing, still nothing. And it's not nothing, but it's minuscule. Twice as much as minuscule. Not good enough at all. Anyway, on to the next one. So, someone's saying here, I feel sorry for the British who are now deep in the shit. That's the result of having won World War II and never question your own big flaws. Now, although those last two bits are definitely related, I agree with that. I mean, this idea of winning World War II, again, is just something that keeps coming up, and it kept coming up during Brexit. And do you know what? The same stupid people, and that, by the way, before I start this, because I'll get comments moaning at me, I'm not suggesting, although I am suggesting that a large number of the people who supported Brexit are also the ones who are not at all helping us with the current crisis. That being said, there are people in favour of Brexit that are absolutely doing the right thing with COVID, and there are people who are in favour of remaining in the EU who are doing the wrong things in terms of managing this crisis. So it's not an exact correlation, but I think there's a fairly sizable one amongst a certain proportion of the population. But they're banging on about Blitz spirit and all the rest of it. And yet we didn't win World War II. They carry on, we won World War II. No, we didn't. We did not. We didn't even win the Battle of Britain without allies from all over the world. And I always say, this idea of, we won the Battle of Britain on our own is offensive to the people who gave their lives in that battle from other nations, in Europe as well as, throughout the Commonwealth. But we didn't, we were on the winning side of World War II, but we did not win it. We were the landing ground, basically. We staged the invasion. America and Russia won it. I mean, let's face facts. We couldn't have done that. We couldn't have organised an invasion of mainland Europe. Well, we could organise it. We didn't have the troops for it. We were knackered. Absolutely knackered. After, 5.5 years of war? We were on our arse. But again, it's this attitude that we did, because people don't actually understand the history. But I do agree that the last part is a direct result of it. Because we have this history of, we're sort of taught the most glorious parts of our history, or the most victorious, should we say. It's not always glorious in today's eyes. And it's true, we don't in this country really face up to our big flaws in our history lessons. History teachers do teach it as well as they can, but the curriculum is not set up to force us to examine our flaws, our historic flaws. So the only way you really become acquainted with these is if you study it yourself. I mean, I did very badly at history at school, actually, but I've read since. Reasonably, I would say I'm above average knowledgeable. I wouldn't say I was an expert. I'm not an expert historian, but I know more than most, but only because I've read. And I thought about it as well. But yeah, this. Whereas in a lot of countries in Europe, they've had to face up to things, whether because they've had to face up to, the fact they've been invaded. It comes back to, again, like I mentioned before, and I'll mention it again. I think one of the big problems we have in Britain is that in lots of parts of Europe, they're fully on board with the European Union as a peace project, because all of them have been invaded at some time in living memory. Becoming a more distant memory now, which could explain some level of complacency creeping into other European countries as well. But we haven't really had that in Britain. I suppose the same thing could arguably be said of Ireland, but of course we did have the Troubles, and to what extent, so that's, they have experienced troops on the street, for example. So that's the same sort of thing. It's that imagery, isn't it? It's not really whether it's a genuine invasion or not, or whether it's just civil. When you've got troops on the street, it doesn't matter whose troops they are even. Troops on your street, you've got martial law being imposed. And maybe we will experience that in this country before long. Let's hope not, but who knows? But because we haven't had that, in Great Britain at least, then we're much more complacent than others, because it's not just a fading memory or a memory that the latest generation don't have. It's a memory that no generation in this country has, because it hasn't happened in living memory. It has happened in the past, but not to the point where anyone can remember it or even have filmed footage of it. So that is a big issue we have in this country. Next one. So, tackle this one. It says, the hypocrisy of you Remoaners is unbelievable. I thought we were rejoiners now. Anyway, it says, you lot have spent the last 4 years arrogantly claiming that we were all knuckle-dragging racist little Englanders just because we wanted to see the UK have stricter controls on who can enter the UK's border. Now, first, I'll tackle this bit by bit. So first of all, no one has said that all people who voted for Brexit were knuckle-dragging, only most, or racist, again, only most, or little Englanders. Because let's face facts, although, you know, pro-EU Scots and Irish, for example, will go, oh, the vast majority of us voted to remain, which is perfectly true. There was a sizable minority in both Northern Ireland and Scotland that voted to leave as well. These people exist everywhere. The Little Englanders arguably is the biggest problem because they're most populous. But those same people existed in Scotland. In Wales, of course, where a majority did vote to leave, and in Northern Ireland as well. And you'd get a reasonable minority in any, I think a diminishing minority now since the Brexit referendum in other EU countries. But you know, this nationalism exists everywhere. It exists everywhere. So no one said it was exclusively the case. But also it says, just because we want to see the UK have stricter controls who can enter the UK's borders. And I will keep saying this, and I will challenge any Brexiteer to show me anywhere in an EU treaty that says that the UK government does not have control of its own borders. Because I've read the treaty that talks about borders, and the EU don't have control over it at all. But it's this mindset that the EU say we can't control our own borders. Of course we can, whenever we like. I mean, the proof of that would be the fact that the way the borders are managed in this country is totally different to other countries. It's much freer across the UK border. We have a much more easy access than in many European countries. You know, again, it's this notion of free movement, which is a bit of a misnomer. I mean, part of this ignorance is because of this misnomer. We don't have free movement in the EU as such. Schengen is much freer. I mean, that's a slightly different thing, but we're not in Schengen. What we have is the right to live and work anywhere in the EU. It's really a visa issue. You don't need visas. So if someone from Germany wishes to live and work in the UK, they can do. They don't have to apply to the UK government to do that. But if someone from Germany with a very serious criminal record were to try and enter the UK can go, hang on a minute, I don't think we really want you in this country, and deny them entry. I mean, you know, so that's a complete nonsense. So when you're moaning that we're treating you all like knuckle dragging, and then you drag your knuckles with these false facts, I mean, you're not helping your own cause there. But not everyone's in that situation. There are some who voted to leave without that level of ignorance. And it says here, you branded every single one of us, no we didn't, only a lot of you, as racist, and you arrogantly claimed we wanted to isolate the UK from the outside world. Yes, that is exactly what you wanted to do. And yet now here you are condemning Boris because he hasn't isolated the UK from the outside world quick enough for you. You honestly couldn't make this up. And again, it's this total cognitive dissonance going on. Isolating us from the world to restrict the coronavirus is very, very damaging to the economy. Massively damaging to the economy. It's also going to damage the social fabric of this country. If you have the best way to deal with this virus is a massive lockdown, a very draconian lockdown. The countries who've done that have got away with far fewer cases, far fewer deaths, which is the important thing. Now, because we've done that too late, we are in very serious trouble. Right? There's going to be a lot of people die. Because do you know what? People's lives are more important than the economy. You can't completely take your eye off the economy. You have to also make sure that we can emerge from this with an economy that can then, because we're going to have to spend our way out of this one. So we're going to need to grow the economy afterwards in order to recoup those costs. But we need to put lives ahead of the economy. So what we're arguing for is isolation for a short period of time to preserve people's lives. What you were talking about was isolating forever. So yes, it's not hypocrisy. You know, with isolation comes economic ruin. We will accept economic damage for a short period of time to preserve lives. What you wanted was economic ruin when there was no need for it. You know, it's a bit like saying, you know, if a doctor for some sort of treatment has to cut you open, some open surgery, for example. And that's for a particular purpose to make you better. And then you're like saying, well, why have you got a problem with me just coming along with a scalpel and slashing you open? You're asking that the doctor does it to them because there's a reason to do it for them. The harm is worth it for the greater benefit. And it's that simple. And yet you couldn't make it up that people cannot actually get this into their thick heads. But this is the world we're living in now. It is desperately disappointing, but that's where we are as a society. Fantastic. Next one. So, it says here, thanks to Boris's ridiculous initial stance of herd immunity, Britain is now playing catch up, and that initial delay in government response is going to cause deaths. Yes, a lot of them. On the 7th of March, Italy had close to 400 deaths. I should have used the chart here. Close to 400 deaths. Boris was at the England versus Wales rugby match, giving the nothing to worry about impression that the country definitely did not need. The UK is 2 weeks behind Italy, where yesterday 475 people died. Remember, this is a few days ago. As I do this, the latest is 700 odd in a day in Italy. The forecasts and trends are that, in fact, I'll put it back up because it is definitely relevant. The forecasts and trends that the UK will follow the same trajectory as Italy, a little bit steeper, in fact, significantly steeper, quite frankly, with the only caveat that Italy had more hospital beds available in its worst hit region, had a lower population density than London. I mean, London, bear in mind, is one of the largest metropoli in the world. So London, as a densely populated area, I think is unique in Europe. I don't think there's anything to rival it in Europe. And that's why, of course, London has been hit extremely bad. And also, you know, as the weekend was beginning, and this is the problem with the lack of beds, which I'll come to on another thing in a minute. A hospital, before we've even really exploded in terms of cases, a hospital in London had to declare a critical situation. It had no critical care beds available. So in other words, if someone was sent to that hospital in need of critical care, they can't get it. They're having to try and find other hospitals that could take them. Now, I'm sure that happened. I hope that happened. There's a lot of hospitals in London. However, once that starts happening in more and more hospitals, you will end up with a situation where people can't get that critical care, even in being taken to another hospital. And the hospital where they can get it might be so far away that in the transit time, you know, they fail completely. And that's why this is going to cause more deaths. We're not just talking about corona deaths here. We're talking about deaths from other health-related issues, injuries or sicknesses where they cannot get treatment. And that is, and as you say there, Italy's healthcare system was fine before this. It's not now. Our healthcare system was not fine before this started. It was already overstretched. Not stretched, overstretched. So that's we are much worse in this country. We are far worse prepared for this in this country. And the other thing I'll just come on to, because I know some people will be going on about, but the government have done a deal with private hospitals to basically get their beds and doctors and stuff like that. Yeah, great. Bear in mind what that means, which I'll add a caveat to this, is that means we're going to be paying a hell of a lot more than if we just funded the NHS properly over the last 10 years. All right? That's a big bill. Now, I'm not saying I don't want the government to do that. Of course, I want them to spare no expense when it comes to saving people's lives. The obvious thing to do is to say, well, there's capacity in the private healthcare system. Of course, we'll have to pay those rates to be able to access them for people that can't afford private healthcare. But nonetheless, that is an extra hit to the economy that was unnecessary. There's going to be plenty of hits to the economy that cannot be helped, and even a competent government cannot help. This is not one of them. And yeah, given the government, I mean, this isn't given the government at the time. It doesn't matter. Let's say Labour had won the general election. The same thing would have had to have happened. They'd have taken measures much sooner, of course. But they would have absolutely done the same thing. They would have had to have done a deal with private hospitals to increase that capacity, because they'd have only had a couple of months to start getting funding back into the NHS, which, you know, takes years to get to claw back 10 years of underfunding. But yeah. Okay, on to the last one. So this was very much about the cheekiness of particularly Richard Branson's Airlines, Virgin Airlines, refusing to pay for his staff, to retain his staff, wanting to retain his staff, not sacking them, wanting to retain them, but asking them to work, not work, but be retained for 2 months without pay. But at the same time asking for a bailout from the government, because he wants the government to pay their wages for them. Now, actually, they should be helped here because the government have agreed to pay the wages of retainers, or at least 80% of them, up to a maximum of £2,500 a month. But I'm quite sure for the piss poor salaries that most of these people are paid at Virgin, that will do it. But someone's saying here, when capitalism fails to plan, socialism is what they demand. Privatise the profits and socialise the losses. And this is absolutely it. And this is what absolutely appalls me about conservative thinking. That, in theory, the way the Conservatives would approach private business is they will tell you that what happens is private business stands and falls on its own, but it doesn't. When it's doing well, it takes the profits. And when something hits the industry, and it doesn't matter whether it's their fault or not, when something hits the industry, what you should expect is they go, right, this is a lean period now, this is going to bite into our profits. No, they want to maintain their profits. They want the taxpayer, us, to pay for their wealth. That's what a bailout is, paying for their wealth. Now, sometimes, yes, you have to bail out a company as a government, of course, but what you should really be doing is nationalising it. Much like we did with Royal Bank of Scotland after the 2008 crisis, it was like, okay, you need a huge government bailout. Right, we want some shares. We want part ownership of this. That's the way it should be done. Richard Branson wants a bailout. Fine. So what you're basically saying is the British government, you want the British government to buy shares in your company. That's what you're saying. Because I'll tell you what, another airline has annoyed me this weekend. Ryanair, I believe it is. I'm going to say an airline. I believe it's Ryanair. Apologies if it's not this one, but I'm pretty sure it is. They've announced that they're going to be paying out a dividend. 160, 170 million quid, something like that, dividend. What? No. You're about to go through a period where you're going to be making losses. You haven't made as much profit as those dividends suggest. You don't pay out dividends until you've paid your bills as a company. That's what the dividend's supposed to be. That's what when you buy shares, it's a little bit of gambling to a certain extent. Obviously, people who play the stock market properly have some knowledge of what they're doing. But ultimately, you know that if something hits that industry, the share price is going to fall because you're not going to get as high a dividend. So that's all there is to it. You cannot expect to pay out a dividend and then say you can't afford to pay your staff. Pay your bills first. Whatever's left that's how profit works. You have your incoming and you have your outgoings. Whatever's left is the profit. You can't just say, well, we need a certain amount of profit. So, but we haven't got enough income to make it. Taxpayer needs to stump up the rest. No. Really annoys me like you wouldn't believe. Like you probably do believe. I don't usually get this irate. But anyway, there we go. Those are the comments for this week. Hope you found it interesting. If you did, don't forget to click the like button. And if you'd like to support the channel further, then please also click the Patreon link for details. And until next time, I'll see you later.